We are going to talk about two things today. I had talked to another group earlier about coping during quarantine, because we all know that this is not an easy time. The leader of that group had reached out to some of the other leaders and said, do you want to have Dushyanthi speak? And Denise reached out to me and I said, sure, I would love to speak. I sat down in my prayer time and I got this whole message about being single in quarantine. It was just like point after point after point after point. And I didn't know where it was coming from. I mean, I knew it was from God, but I didn't know why I was getting it. And I literally just downloaded it. I just started writing it. So I messaged Denise and I said, hey, what's your group like? Like, are people married, single? And she's like, oh, it's basically like 90% single women. I said, okay, then. I said, so that's why I got that message. So I'm super excited to share with you. So I'll touch a little bit about coping during COVID, but a lot of this talk is going to be about what it's like to be a single woman during the quarantine and to quarantine single. And if there's married women on here, there is stuff in here for you as well.
Amen.
Awesome.
Amen.
Glory to God.
Yeah. So this is just, I'm just the messenger on this one. So the question that I'm getting asked the most, and people DM me this on social media, my patients ask me, and they're like, why can I not be productive? I have all these things that I want to do and I'm not getting anything done. So the first thing I do is I remind everyone that we're going through grief and trauma at the same time. Okay. So our definition in psychology of trauma is something that is incredibly stressful, that makes you feel helpless in a world that's not safe. So when you're in trauma or when you're in grief, your moods are going to fluctuate. You'll feel anxious. You may feel irritable. You may feel depressed. You may feel sad. So I'm sure some of you guys have heard about when there's a traumatic event, we go into fight or flight mode. So either fight or we run, but psychologists are actually finding a third mode that's called freeze. So if you think about like a deer in headlights, what does it do when it thinks it's in danger?
Freeze.
Right. And it freezes. It doesn't run. It doesn't fight. It just freezes. Right. And a lot of us are going through that right now, where it's difficult to motivate because our brain, so the brain actually releases these chemicals, and there's a part of the brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex, and it makes that part of the brain stop. It impacts that part of the brain so that it makes it difficult to function. This is what's going on in our bodies and in our brains beyond our control, just based on what's happening in the world. So you can be gentle with yourself when maybe you're not getting as much done as you'd like to get done in a day. What we know about trauma and grief when we work with people on how to heal it, we know the only way to get over it is to go through it. Right? So giving yourself time, giving yourself a space for that grief, talking to friends about it, journaling it, giving yourself days where you feel sad or you feel frustrated. All of those things are important in getting through grief. We have the book of Lamentations, which is a whole book of just calling out to God and being like, this is hard. I am suffering. And that's the whole purpose of that book. We know what Jesus did when he went and saw that Lazarus was dead. Does anyone remember the first thing he did? He cried. So even Jesus himself experienced grief, even though he knew the end of the story. He knew he was about to raise him from the dead, but he's like, no, this is my time to be sad. So I just want to encourage you all to give yourself that time to be sad right now if you need it. The Bible says, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again and you will rejoice and no one will take away your joy. So we do have that promise, but we also are given that time of grief as well. So all of that said, keeping that in mind, there's still some practical tips that we can do to just kind of keep moving on our day-to-day. So one of the things I'm telling my patients right now, shower, get dressed, make your bed, right? So I see some laughter over there and, look, I get it. I definitely have those days where I'm in my sweats and I don't want to, but if your goal is to try to say, okay, how do I get up and do something? A little harder to do something when you're just not in that right frame of mind. Making the bed is that old Navy SEAL mentality. You do one task And then it gives you the energy to do the next task. And, you know, my patients who've done it, they're like, yeah, you know, for some reason I do feel better after I made my bed. I don't know why. So it's worth a shot, and give it a try and see how it goes. The other thing, and in psychology we call it, there's a gap between intention and action, what I want to do and what I'm actually getting done. Very simple tip to help with that: set a time of when you're going to start each activity that you have planned or task for the day. So almost like you're making an appointment for yourself. At 10 a.m., I am going to start doing work on this. By 11 a.m., I'm going to do this. By 12, I'm going to take a 15-minute break or a lunch break or whatever it might be. But setting that time, and I do this with my ADHD patients who have difficulty concentrating on a regular day. It gives you some kind of structure. And just keep in mind that if it doesn't happen, remember what I said first about trauma and grief, and be gentle with yourself. Maybe you got one thing done on the list, maybe you got 2 things done on the list, and just each day allow yourself to make a little bit more progress and a little bit more progress. I see some smiles and nods over there from the ladies. And, you know, just some general advice that we're giving in psychology: exercise, 30 minutes of cardio 5 times a week. That's a lot. We live in California where it's beautiful. We can take walks. They've just opened the beaches and the hiking trails. But that releases serotonin in the brain, which is the chemical, the neurotransmitter that makes us happy. They also suggest sunshine for 20 minutes in the morning. So why in the morning? Because in the morning, that sunshine releases serotonin, that same happy neurotransmitter in the brain. But 12 hours later, that serotonin changes into melatonin, which is what helps us sleep at night. A lot of people are telling me they're having difficulty sleeping. So actually getting that sunshine in the morning helps the brain produce the melatonin that helps us sleep well at night. Setting regular bedtimes, waking up at regular times, trying to keep a regular schedule as much as possible. Psychology always also talks about prayer, that people who have a strong prayer life tend to do better in a crisis. So that regular time in prayer right now is super important, and meditation. I know a lot of Christian people are not always sure about meditation. Meditation does something different than prayer. There's a lot of science that backs it right now, but it just calms the whole nervous system. We know now with science, it lowers your blood pressure, it calms your racing heart. And actually, if you study Christianity, in ancient Christianity, there was something called contemplative Christianity that was actually like meditation. So there are some roots of it in Christianity. It just got taken out over the years. So those are kind of some general guidelines about surviving the quarantine. I'm going to give some space for questions at the end if anyone has any questions about things they're particularly struggle with. But I want to move into the points that I feel were meant for you guys, which are the points about singleness that came to me that morning after I got that email from Denise about talking to you. So the first point that I got is that God sees your singleness. So you are not alone in this. Even if you are alone, he is still with you. So people are feeling really lonely right now. And it is lonely. It's hard. If you're single, if you're quarantining alone and you see those pictures on social media of, you know, your married friends with their families and their kids, it can kind of reinforce that feeling of loneliness. Those women are complaining to me that they really want some singleness in space right now. So, you know, just keeping in mind that this is a season. I have a very good friend who has been single for a very long time. He is in his 60s. He lives out in the wood. He's like, I love being single. And I spoke to him recently and he's like, I'm lonely for the first time ever. So he's like, I don't mind being single, but there's something about this quarantine that has made people feel particularly lonely. And there are some papers coming out about just the lack of touch in general. When we touch other people, the brain releases oxytocin, that happy chemical. So even giving somebody a hug or a handshake, all of that stuff feels good. So we're getting less and less of that as time goes on, and it's causing this feeling of loneliness. But for the women who are single, I just wanted to remind you that this is intentional that you're single in this moment and there's a purpose for it. So I was thinking of, you know, the women in the Bible. Who are the women that we hear about the most in the Bible? There's so much spoken about the men, but some of the most prominent women in the Bible, what they are known for most is waiting, being lonely and waiting, right? So we have Ruth, who was the widower, right? She was waiting for her husband. We have Rachel. Remember, Rachel and Leah were sisters, and the dad had Jacob marry Leah. So Rachel had to wait another 7 years, I think 14 years total. Then we have Sarah, who waited for the baby, Hannah and Elizabeth, who were waiting for a baby, right? So this having babies and being single and being married, these are all tied together. But these women were known for this process of waiting. So if we really, I'm going to look at two of these stories. So Ruth, right? So Ruth was the widower. She was married, and then she leaves her home country with her mother-in-law to go to her mother-in-law's hometown of Bethlehem to escape the famine. So this is a trip that, you know, it's not an easy trip. You're going hundreds of miles. They're traveling through famine. They're traveling through desert. And Ruth says to her mother-in-law, don't ask me to leave you. Let me go with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and that's where I'll be buried. May the Lord's worst punishment come upon you if anything but death separate me from you. Now that sounds like marriage to me, right? So she's a single woman, and she found this complete love and commitment and fulfillment in this relationship with her mother-in-law. So I think the story of Ruth really shows us a couple things. One, that there can be love after heartbreak, right? Because we know she finds her Boaz eventually, but that's her second time. So we know that after that first heartbreak, there can be somebody else. We also know there can be fulfillment, life, you know, like till death do us part fulfillment with someone else besides a man. And we also know that at the end of it, after she kind of, you know, she and her mother-in-law made this plan, and they traveled and they found work and they made sure they were cared for, then the man came in. So they were not rescued. They kind of did their own thing. And then God blessed her with the man, who then enhanced her life. But she was already pretty complete. But he still granted her that desire. So then we look at the story of Hannah. Okay, Hannah's another one of my favorite stories because Hannah waited. So we have to remember that waiting for a man and waiting for a child back then had to be worse than what it is now, because these women did not have the kind of opportunities that we have to pursue career and do all these different things. This was what they were defined by. So Hannah's waiting for this child, and you know, she's essentially a worthless woman in that society if she can't have a baby. And she says, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. So she is desperate. She is praying, and she's incredibly distressed. And she's like asking God, I need this baby. So this priest comes to her. The priest thinks she's drunk. He's like, what's wrong with you? You've been drinking. She's like, no, I haven't been drinking. I'm not crazy. I promise. I'm sad because I don't have a baby. So the priest says, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him. And her response is, may your servant find favor in your eyes. She went on her way. She ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. So that is the main point of the story. The point of the story is not eventually that God gave her the baby. She found her peace. She started eating, and her face was no longer downcast. She was no longer depressed because she believed in the promise before it even came. So what we see in these stories of these women, we see them growing closer to God. We see them growing stronger in their own right. And then we see the fulfillment of their heart's desire. So which brings us to and those stories kind of go for the rest of the points that I'm going to go through. So one, this quarantine singleness draws us closer to God.
Yes.
Right. So we know that Jesus withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So even Jesus, when he wanted to hear God, he went to a lonely place to pray. So this solitude is really an opportunity to really lean in and hear God and say, what do you have for me in this quarantine? What do you want me to learn? What is my purpose? Something I told myself when I was recovering, I wished I could do this and this and this. And I would remind myself, God's given me everything I need to do his calling for me today. This is intentional. There's nothing else he wants me to do that I can't do, that I don't have everything I need for. And that's the same thing for us right now. Joyce Meyer, who's one of my favorite biblical teachers, she talks about hearing God as, God is in the Bible as a small, still voice. And she said, when there's a lot of chatter and a lot of voices around us, it's so difficult to hear him. So she says, it's like someone's whispering to you at a party, but the party's so loud you can't hear. And that's why the Bible really values solitude. Jesus values solitude. And I think God intentionally sometimes puts us in this place of solitude so we can hear him that much clearer. The next point is that there are benefits of singleness and lessons in singleness. So in singleness and getting through this quarantine, and I'm a woman who is quarantining on my own for this, you develop your strength, your independence, and your confidence. You see what you can do on your own, and you see where you have to rely on God, where God can fill in those gaps. So yeah, it would be great to have someone who could go to the store and get the toilet paper for me. But it's also great to see what, especially when I give it to God, what can happen. So, and in both those stories we went through of the women, we saw the beauty in their singleness and in the waiting and how much they grew in who they were and in their strength and in their faith before they got what they were asking for. The next point I was really feeling was give your failed relationships to God. So something, I see an amen over there, but what we know as therapists is that trauma triggers trauma. It's all stored in the same place in the brain. So if the quarantine and what's happening in the world is traumatic, it can trigger trauma that we had as a childhood. It can trigger trauma from the pain of an ex. So a lot of people, when they're home alone, they're thinking and processing about all these old hurts and traumas. And you don't even realize why you're thinking about this now, because it's not happening now. But it's because that's the way that the brain works. Trauma can build. One trauma builds on the next trauma. So letting go of those exes in this time, surrender. So I think a lot of people are like, well, why didn't it work with this person? I had spiritual confirmation. I prayed about it. I know I've been there. And, it's one of two things. So one, either we heard wrong, or two, there's free will. And God gives free will. So God could have had this person for us, but he's not going to force somebody. Someone else can make the wrong decision, and that can affect us. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a plan B and a plan C for us, because he won't punish us for someone else's mistake. And we see this story biblically in the story between Samuel and Saul. So God told Samuel, you're going to choose Saul to be the king. And Saul ended up being disobedient. And then God rejected him as the king. So Samuel was frustrated about this because he had kind of invested and he thought Saul was going to be the king. So God says to him, how long will you mourn for Saul? I have rejected him as the king. And he says, I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. So I love that part. How long will you mourn for him? Fill your horn and be on your way. So God tells him, I know that was my plan, but I got a new one for you. So keep it moving. And really just being able to trust that there is another plan coming, because if someone else made a mistake to hurt you. So just really being able to surrender, whoever's made that choice, but surrender and give that situation to God. Trust that he's going to bring the new one to you at the right time. So something that I read recently, Mark Batterson, who's another one of my favorites, he says, when you shut the door, you are released from a situation. And when the door opens, you are called to it. And I love that description because it's almost like talking about bondage. When you keep that door open, you're almost still in bondage from that past situation. So really being able to shut that door and see what is the new door that God has to open, which brings me to my next part, which is online dating. So psychologists are not talking a lot about single people in the quarantine, but they are talking a lot about single people online dating. So we have to surrender to God. We also have to do our part. Now, I don't believe everybody should always be online dating. I think you need to pray about this and see if this is something God wants for you. But what we are seeing, they said, Tinder had like a 20% increase in the last couple weeks, and all the online dating sites are booming. And what I'm seeing even through patients and friends is people are getting into more serious relationships more quickly, because this is forcing people. One, you have less options. We have too many options here. So we have less options, and people are taking partnership and dating more seriously. People who are alone are like, hey, it really would be nice to shelter in place with somebody else. And they're looking for who that person could be. So the whole mindset around online dating is better. So if you feel that this is the time that God is saying, yes, step out and see what is out there, make connections, get to know people. It's a safe way to do it right from home, and it is booming right now. That said, as you do it, you surrender your desire to God, right? So we're surrendering our ex to God, we're surrendering our desires, and we are surrendering the timing. And that is the hardest thing, is really being able to say, this is not my timing, your timing. And in psychology, the thing is, we can understand all these things conceptually, but really in psychology, we talk about retraining the brain, like daily conditioning the mind. So we may understand all this tonight in this talk, and then tomorrow morning that loneliness hits, or we go to bed and that loneliness hits, and it's going to keep coming. And it's about really just reminding your mind every time, no, I am not alone in this. God is with me in this. I'm going to surrender this desire to him. This is going to come in the perfect time. And you have to remind yourself of that many, many, many times a day. It's the same thing I do when I work with patients with anxiety, depression, whatever they're struggling with. They can't tell themselves one time. They tell themselves over and over and over again. The Bible says this too, about renewing your mind, right? You have to constantly be renewing your mind. And, my last point about being single during the quarantine is celebrate his provision now. So if we look, there are blessings right now. So we can see that there are certain friends that we get to choose as our family, right? So we get to choose who are the people that we want to invest our time with, so there's socially distanced, safe outdoor activities now that people are doing, and who we can really count on during this time, and focus on whatever those things are that are thriving, whether it's your friendship, whether it's the work you're doing from home, whether it's a project. There, if you look, I'm sure there are some things in your life that God has given you as a blessing, and it's going to be different for different people. So we all know about keeping our eyes on the promise, and I think we can get caught into saying, but the promise is coming, but it is also important to live in the now. And, the Bible said, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. That's something that I tell myself in the morning when I don't feel great, when I wake up. This is still the day that God made, and there is something good today. And if we look back again at those women, we see that they got themselves together and they found their peace before the man entered their life. And in all of these ways, we see that the singleness was very intention for them, or the waiting period, whether it was for the husband or for the baby. And we can see this waiting, and we can see this singleness really as being a gift.